Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the technique thrusting wedge and how to relate it to other elements of the American Kenpo system. Keep in mind two things. First, this is not a comprehensive list. And second, it's not family groupings. The way to think about these videos is they're just different avenues to explore so that you can relate this element to other elements of the American Kenpo system. So let's start this relationship with the combining of two different concepts. Concept number one being degrees of anticipation. Another way to think about that is how ready am I to accept an attack? And the second one being degrees of defense. In other words, how defensive versus offensive are we being? Or offensive, how we're being. So it's a little bit complex, so bear with us, and I'm sure this will make sense as we go forward through the video. So I'm going to turn my back to my opponent. Why? For two reasons. One, to show you that A, he's in my obscure zone or in darkness. That's another way to think about this in Kenpo. Why am I doing that? Because if he's out of my field of vision, I can get caught off guard very easily, and then I'm going to have to deal with it after the fact. And that brings in something like a leap from danger. So that's the exact same thing, but now bring it up just a little bit. So again, could be in my field of vision, or maybe in the edge of my field of vision, and I get caught yet again off guard. So now I have to deal with it after he pushed me again, and that brings in something like an encounter with danger. So let's move this up a little bit. So up to now, they've been doing these pushes, right? So if you think about it, the push is basically the amount of time they're making contact with us. They're not really applying anything to us. If you increase the amount of time that they have contact with us, we call that an application. They're applying something to us. So again, we were caught off guard because we should have been able to catch that before it got to us, but we didn't. So now we have to bring in that second concept. How are we going to be dealing with this now that they've made contact with us? So let's go through that spectrum. So the first end of that spectrum would be, I want to be completely defensive first. And that brings something like a twin kimono, where I isolate the situation, make sure I'm ready to go, and then I can respond to that situation. So let's bring that up a notch, something like a cross of death, where I'm going to be dealing with it both defensively and offensively simultaneously with one another. And one way to do that is through sophisticated maneuvers like this. Okay? So let's move that up to the far end of the spectrum, where now we get something like a destructive twins, where I'm not even going to be dealing with the defensive part first. I'm going to be dealing with attacking the attack first. And then once I've done that, now I deal with the things that they've done to me. Okay? So that's enough of that end of the spectrum. Now you can think of this as a hard line. Now let's go into actual anticipation, where we're actually seeing it come at us. We're able to anticipate it and deal with it while it's in flight. So let's bring in that second end of the spectrum of how we're doing it defensively versus offensively. So let's start out at the far end of the spectrum and talk about evasion, where we really don't even have to defend it. We're just moving out of the way. And that would bring in something like a leaping crane, or even something like a circling horizon. And then off to the opposite side of that, that would bring in something like a reversing mace. Notice that they did the evasion in a slightly different manner. One was completely moving out of the way. The other one was doing up the circle. So let's bring that up a little bit and say, okay, let's actually deal with the in-flight weapon. So let's do it through the way we did at the beginning, something like a twin kimono, where we actually did the defense followed by an offense. And that would bring in something like an attacking mace, a parting wings, or even something like an aggressive twins. Okay? So let's combine those two ideas, and then what we're going to do is we're going to get defense with offense simultaneously. And that would bring in something like our base technique, thrusting wedge, where we're doing both at the same time. Or even if we move it now to an obscure area, so we're going to do the exact same thing, but think of it more close to leap from danger, where it's now an obscure area, but we're doing the exact same thing that we did in thrusting wedge, which is both at the same time. And that brings in something like a brushing the storm. So this brings us to the final end of the spectrum that you can think about this, where we are ready for an attack, but our opponent is not. And that brings in something like a hopping crane. Up. So how did we relate thrusting wedge to other elements? Well, we did it through a combining of two concepts: degrees of anticipation with degrees of defense versus offense. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.